Hello viewers, once a study has been undertaken and data analysis has been done, the next step is to interpret the results and write a research report. A research report is written to disseminate the findings of the study if the study has been taken up by an independent researcher as a teacher. But once a study has been completed as a requirement for completion of degree, whether it is a master's degree or a PhD, then a thesis or dissertation needs to be submitted and that needs to be evaluated. Any person who is going through a research needs to have the capability of evaluating research report. Let's find out what are some of the issues which can be addressed in this presentation. The structure of presentation includes answering the major four questions, that is, why is it essential to evaluate research report? What needs to be evaluated? What should be the parameters of evaluating the various aspects or elements of the research report, and who should evaluate any piece of research? Let's try to find out answer to the very first question. That is, why is it essential to evaluate research report? The very first purpose which evaluation of report can serve as to improve the quality of research. Once you try to examine the various elements of the research report, you will be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of that research report. And once you are able to highlight the weaknesses in the research, maybe that becomes a guideline for future research work and those weaknesses can be avoided. Or if the researcher wants to improve upon the research undertaken, even that can be helped by the evaluation of research. The second purpose, it enhances the use of findings of research. Once you find that appropriate design has been used, proper sampling techniques were used, proper analysis has been done, and correctly the results have been interpreted, one can utilize the findings of research in various contexts. The applicability of the research findings is enhanced once a piece of research is evaluated. Evaluation of research report also helps in decision making. Say for example, you have taken up a sponsored research and there has been funding agency like All India Council for Technical Education or Department of Science and Technology. Now these agencies, when evaluate the piece of research, they can further take a decision whether to continue funding the research or whether they need to fund the research in future also to the organization which has taken up the sponsored research. It also aids in planning future research. So that is where the evaluation of research can help, that whether further research is required in the area or not, or whether the data was accessible and similar studies can be taken up in future too, these decisions can be taken up. In addition to these four purposes, evaluation of research report can also help in identifying the gaps in the competencies of the researcher. Maybe you come across that many of the studies which have been taken up, they fall under the category of descriptive research. Or you come out with many of the studies which are taken up, they are using non-random samples and thus the findings of the study cannot be generalized. You may come across that the researcher was not able to implement the experimental procedure in toto which he or she has planned. Maybe this gives a feedback to the people who try to enhance the capability of researcher that such kind of evaluation of research can help in designing and implementing training programs which aim at enhancing the research competences of the researcher. So these are 5 major purposes which can be served by evaluation of research report or reports. Now let's have a close look at what is it that a research report consists of. The structure of research report consists of preliminary pages. It has first chapter as introduction. The second chapter in most of the research reports is on review of related literature. That is what has been done in the past. And then a chapter which follows is on methods and procedures which have been followed to undertake the research. And the next chapter includes the data analysis and results. And the last chapter is on summary and conclusions, and then a report consists of references, the work which have been cited in the research report. Preliminary pages include the title of the report, research report, especially a thesis which has a very specified format. So it varies from university to university. This is Punjab University and this is Punjabi University format which has been taken up. So you can see it gives the title of the thesis, where it has been submitted. It specifies that it has been submitted to Faculty of Education and Information Science, Punjabi University, and it is for the doctoral degree, and then who is the supervisor and the co-supervisor, the name of the investigator and the university insignia, and then the Department of Education where the research was carried out. And then it also contains the year in which the thesis have been submitted. So there is set format and it varies from university to university, and one needs to follow the specified pattern. After that, acknowledgements appear where the author tries to acknowledge the contribution of various people, including the guide, including the sample, including the authorities to whom he or she has consulted. So it is a text form and the person tries to express the gratitude. That is followed by an abstract. Most of the thesis nowadays has a component on abstract where a brief summary of the work which has been done is specified. Then comes the contents. Now here you see it gives you the organization of the report. Maybe you can start with the acknowledgement, then the contents will comprise of the chapters of the report. Here you see that in this particular example, the person has added another chapter on theoretical views, or person can label it as theoretical background, followed by review and methods and procedure. And you see that the first chapter comprises of A, B, C, D, 4 sections. You can also number these sections. Here in another example you find this, that a person started with acknowledgements, list of contents, list of tables, and then the chapter wise organization of the report, and has given numbering. Now if it is number 1, it is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and against that the pagination has been done, which is followed by list of tables, and list of figures which are part of the research report, and pages are indicated here. So when it comes to preliminary pages, what should be the criteria of evaluating these preliminary pages? Now when it is a title page, as I said earlier, the format specified by a particular university needs to be followed, and there cannot be any deviation from the specified format. Even the color of the title page is specified in many of the universities. So the format, if it is as per the format specified by the university, we accept that it is of quality. Acknowledgements, two things need to be evaluated: the language used by the person and the brevity in reflecting or expressing the gratitude to the persons who have contributed to the research report. So when it comes to language, maybe the simplicity of language, the grammatical correctness of the language needs to be evaluated. When it comes to table of contents, again the formatting which has been done. Now in the two examples which were shown to you, one thesis only gave chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. The other person has tried to come out with 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. So once you are trying to evaluate the research report, you need to look into that the contents are organized and the numbering system is followed for the facility of the reader and for the facility of the presentation of the contents. And one can also look into the accuracy with which the organization is represented. Say for example, the references appear on page 272. While you are indicating references in your content page, by mistake you have made it 270. Now this, once a person is trying to evaluate, he is also looking at whether the contents which are presented, they appear in the main text or in the thesis on the same page which is reflected on the content page. So correctness of the content is also examined while evaluating a research report. Then comes list of tables. List of tables, again you have a serial number, the table heading and the page number. So what is it that needs to be evaluated is whether the table appears on the page where it is referred to. Likewise, list of illustrations, and then comes the abstract. Abstract provides you a synoptic view of the research which has been carried out. So it gives in brief the rationale, the review of related literature, the gaps which were identified, and the procedure which was followed and the main findings of the study. So one has to evaluate the abstract in terms of its relevance, whether the whole research report has been summarized on one page or at the most 2 pages, and then whether what has been summarized has been correctly referred to, and then one needs to look into the brevity. The abstract cannot run into pages, so it should be restricted to 1 page, at the most to 2 pages in the whole thesis. Then comes the chapter on introduction. Once we talk about the introduction, normally the headings which are included and are important include rationale, statement of the problem, significance of the problem, and objectives of the study. Now when it comes to rationale, one needs to go into the accuracy with which the rationale has been put forth. Whether the person has been able to go deeper into the context and identify a real problem that exists within a context and is able to bring out that rationale in the report, and whether the rationale which is built in is adequate, or the person has taken a very limited viewpoint of the context and come out with a problem. When it comes to statement of the problem, one is concerned with the clarity with which the problem has been stated, the variables which have been identified, and how this problem is going to solve a particular problem in the context. Another parameter for evaluation is the researchability of the research undertaken. That means the problem which was identified, whether it was feasible to conduct the research, whether the data was accessible to the person, whether the time which was available to the researcher, he could undertake that study and do justice with that kind of study, whether the population for which the study has been undertaken, a true representative sample could be selected to justify the generalizability of finding. So researchability would include all these parameters. Then the size of the problem which has been selected. Whether the person has taken up a problem by taking only the limited number of variables, or whether the person has taken the variable which were enormous and the person has limited time to collect data objectively and in a reliable manner for that particular study. So the size, whether the size of the problem was adequate in terms of the number of variables and the time which was available and the kind of resources which were available to the researcher. Accessibility of data, whether the sample was approachable and the person could gather that data in a reliable and valid manner. Then significance of the problem has to be evaluated in terms of the worthwhileness of the problem. Whether the problem which was undertaken that could add to the existing body of knowledge. That is the first question, whether it led to any advancement of knowledge or whether it has only verified the principle or theories which have already been proven by a number of research studies in the past. Then one could think of what value the research which has been undertaken has for the researcher himself, for the funding agency, or for the other stakeholders in the system. So whether it is going to benefit the researcher, benefit the administrator, benefit the teacher in the classroom, benefit the regulatory agency in general, or will the study be relevant or of value to other people who are not directly involved in the process of managing the system or undertaking the related activities. So you need to evaluate the significance of the problem from two angles: the advancement of knowledge and the value of the research for the people who are directly interested in, the stakeholders, and the people who are indirectly connected to it. Objectives of the study need to be clearly specified. And if you have clear objectives, then the whole process of undertaking research is very smooth and person doesn't come across any problems in undertaking research. So the research study which has been undertaken, its objectives need to be clearly specified in a statement form. Otherwise, a researcher can also include research questions in the first chapter to which one would like to find an answer to. So objectives, they need to be very specific, they need to be in the statement form, and they need to be correctly specified by taking into account the various variables of research study. So one needs to look into the statement form, correctness of the objectives and the adequacy of the objectives in terms of the variables included in the study. Then comes a chapter on review of related literature. The researcher tries to synthesize the research which has been carried out in the past and tries to identify the gaps that exist, and that also enable the researcher to formulate the hypothesis for research. So the four things which are important is the organization of review of related literature, the conclusions drawn on the basis of the past research, the gaps in research identified by the researcher, and then the hypotheses which are formulated for the research undertaken. When it comes to organization of review of related literature, most of the researchers try to organize the research studies in chronological manner, irrespective of many a times of the variables which have been undertaken as a part of study. Say for example, you are concerned with job satisfaction and organizational climate in the technical institution. Now the two main variables are the job satisfaction, another is organizational climate, and then maybe the third is the job satisfaction and organizational climate. So one can organize past research under three main headings: review of related studies in the area of job satisfaction of technical teachers, then organizational climate of technical teachers, and then organizational climate and job satisfaction in technical institution. So one can look at whether the review is complete. When I say complete, that means whether the person has been able to explore a variety of primary and secondary sources from where he could gather the information, or whether only a limited portion of sources of information has been tapped. Complete can also be in terms of the length of period which has been taken into consideration, whether the researcher has delimited the review to 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and whether he could do justice with those 10, 15 or 20 years. Then one has to look into the correctness of the review of related literature. So whether the person has been able to correctly put forth the studies in the review of related literature. Then the clarity with which the person has tried to organize the related literature, and coherence. When we talk about coherence, so that means the presentation has to be in a continuous and a similar manner. So if you are including in various studies the objective, the sample, the findings, and then coming out with the suggestion for further research, so whether the pattern which has been followed to present the review is coherent, or whether there is logical shift from one paragraph to another, or whether there is a link created in the paragraphs which follow, that is to be seen. Then whether the review of related literature is presented in brevity. That means it is not that the abstract is picked up from the journal or the thesis and placed in the review of related literature. It needs to be concise and to the point, and thus completeness, correctness, clarity, coherence, conciseness are some of the parameters that need to be evaluated. When it comes to the conclusions which are drawn, then one is only concerned with the correctness of conclusions drawn on the basis of the presentation of review of related literature. Likewise, gaps in research need to be correctly identified by the researcher. And when it comes to hypothesis, again the correctness matters. Now, if the whole review of related literature says that open climate will have, or this teach sorry if the whole literature says that the job satisfaction of teacher is significantly higher in an open organizational climate as compared to the closed climate, the review of related literature indicates that there has to be a directional hypothesis and not a null hypothesis. Many a times, because of the statistical convenience, we try to formulate the null hypothesis rather than the directional hypothesis. So one has to look into whether the hypotheses have been formulated in a correct manner and they flow from the conclusions drawn by the researcher on the basis of the presentation of review of related literature. The next is the methods and procedures which have been used by the researcher to undertake the study, and it includes the elements of design, whether descriptive, correlational, experimental or ex post facto research has been undertaken, the sample which has been selected for the study from the accessible population, then the tools which were used to gather data and information from the sample, then if it was an experimental study, what was the experimental setup, what was the experimental procedure, then comes how that experimental procedure was implemented, so collection of data, and the last element which is important in this chapter is the statistical techniques used. So when it comes to design, one is interested in evaluating where if the researcher has used a descriptive study, was it appropriate to the objectives of the study? Was that design appropriate to the hypotheses which were formulated? So, appropriateness of the design with respect to the objectives and hypotheses need to be evaluated, and the feasibility, whether the person who has taken up the descriptive or ex post facto or a case study, whether it was feasible for the researcher to implement that design in the real context. When it comes to sample, the adequacy, the size of the sample is one parameter which needs to be evaluated. In many of the researches which are available, where the population goes beyond 10,000, the people have taken up study, especially at the master's level, only of 100 students or 150 students. Now the findings are not generalizable. So one needs to look, if somebody is dealing with a population of 10,000, minimum 10% of that sample is essential. So the size, whether the size of the sample was adequate and whether the sampling technique used was correct. Now if you have strata in the sample, that is you had strata in the population, then sample should have those strata represented. But many a times it happens that people take a convenience sampling or a simple random sampling and avoid getting into selecting stratified random sampling. So one needs to look into whether, if possible, the sampling technique which was appropriate to the population was used and whether the findings are generalizable or not. So correct sampling technique would facilitate generalizability of findings. Then measuring tools need to be valid, reliable and objective. So measuring tools, if standardized tests are used, these are to be looked into. The test which may be valid in US may not be valid in India. So whether the validity has been determined in Indian context, that is to be seen. If a person has developed a test, then one need to look into whether the test which was designed and developed by the researcher Has he tried to determine its validity, reliability, or not? When it comes to experimental procedure, then one needs to look into whether the researcher has given adequate explanation of the experimental procedure so that it can be replicated by the other researchers, and it tries to determine the context and tries to highlight the delimitations also. Thus, internal and external validity variables, they are expressed or explained in the experimental procedure so as to enable others to replicate the experimental procedure in real context. Then collection of data needs to be as per the planned procedure. So if the person has given an experimental procedure, that needs to be implemented in toto as far as the collection of data. So if you had planned for that you are going to collect the data through questionnaire, make 10% of the interviews later on, and then 10% of the sample you'll observe in real context. So one has to look into the collection of data, so whether the person was able to implement the procedure for data collection in toto or as per the plan. Statistical techniques used, only one parameter of evaluation would be the appropriateness of statistical technique used. So again here comes in those four important aspects: whether the purpose or the objective which were specified for the research, they fulfill the purpose. Second, they achieve the objectives of the study. Secondly, the hypotheses which were formulated for the study, whether the technique used was appropriate to the hypothesis formulated in the study. Third thing is the scales of measurement. So whether the nominal scale of data, that is data was available in the nominal scale, ordinal scale, or interval scale. So these, and in addition to that, one can look to the sampling technique used. So all these appropriateness of statistical techniques is to be carried out in the light of these four parameters. Then comes a chapter which is very important in the whole research report, that is data analysis and research results. How the researcher is able to present the analysis and how he is able to interpret the findings of the study. So here the evaluator can look into whether the presentation of results address the major questions which were raised in the beginning of the study, or the objectives which were specified, or whether the person has tried to organize the data analysis and results under the broad headings of hypothesis. Then one can look into the accuracy with which the results have been interpreted. Many of the people do not know the interpretation of the probability levels or the alpha levels. So what they write is the T ratio was found to be significant at 0.05 level. So whether the person is able to interpret this 0.05 level by saying that if the experiment is repeated 100 times, there are 95 chances that the similar results would be obtained. Or in other words, there are only 5 chances that the results would vary from the observed results. So interpretation is very important, and likewise somebody who is taking up correlational research only writes highly significant correlation was found between intelligence and achievement. But interpretation is higher the intelligence, higher will be the achievement scores. So whether the person is able to do that accurately is what the evaluator is looking at. The tables form an integral part of data analysis and results. Thus, the correctness of the tables the summarization of results. Many times what you get from the SPSS, that is being reflected in the thesis. But that should not be the purpose of the researcher. Researchers should sift the findings and represent only those which are essential to accept or reject the hypothesis. Unnecessary calculations need to be avoided as far as the representation of tables is concerned. Illustrations, if included, maybe in the form of graph, maybe line graph, bar graph, column graph, or any other area graph, and so on, these need to be correct and the quality. When I say quality, maybe if you have a line graph, then you are concerned with whether the x-axis, y-axis have been labeled, whether the units have been correctly taken, whether there has been proper labeling of the line graph or not, or the lines are distinguishable or not. Then interpretation of results need to be correct, and once the researcher has presented the result, he must try to relate it to the research which has been carried out in the past. So whether the results are corroborated by the findings of the previous studies or not, that needs to be included in the chapter on the results. Otherwise, review of related literature does not find any relevance with respect to the findings of the study. So, two things very important: correctness of interpretation of results, and then second thing is whether the person has tried to build relationship between the past research and the findings of the present study. So one needs to clearly bring out whether the findings of the study are in tune with the past finding or in contradiction, and if in contradiction, what could be the possible reasons for that. The last chapter in the thesis includes summary and conclusions. And here, the researcher tries to include recommendations for future research and implications for research. So when we look to the summary, it gives you, again, like abstract, the summary also provides you a summary of the research which has been undertaken. So it includes introduction, review, then the methods and procedure, and the major findings. So one has to look into whether the major elements of the report find a place in the summary, whether the summarization is brief, concise. It cannot again run into pages as you have included in the report. It has to be smaller in number. Then the correctness of presentation of the data and the information. When it comes to arriving at the conclusions, the evaluator must try to evaluate the conclusions with respect to its appropriateness. So, appropriate conclusions have been drawn. One should not try to have conclusions which do not form a part of the study. So, one should remain within the boundaries of the research undertaken. Then when it comes to recommendations and implication, the correctness is one of the parameters against which the report needs to be evaluated, and one needs to evaluate implication of research also in terms of whether the implications of research have been discussed keeping in view the various stakeholders. So say for example, technical education, you take up a research. So you yourself, being a teacher in the technical education system, you are interested in it. Other teachers may be interested in your research. Then the administrator may be interested, the regulatory agency may be interested. So one has to look into if there are implications for teachers, implications for administrator, implications for other researchers. One needs to include implications for all the various stakeholders. And last part of your research report consists of either references or bibliography and the appendices. So one needs to look into if it's a thesis report which is in the social sciences, and here we are talking about taking up research in technical education. So the references and the bibliography has to be strictly in accordance with the specified format of American Psychological Association, and that too they have different format for books, journals, reference material, direct or indirect quotes, etc. So one has to look into the bibliography and references vis-a-vis the APA style of writing, the references or the bibliography. When it comes to appendices, one has to determine the relevance of the material which is appended to the thesis. So whether the data has been appended, whether the raw scores have been appended, or whether the tests used in the study, they have been appended. So one needs to look into the relevance. So no irrelevant material should be appended to the thesis report. So these are some of the parameters of evaluation of the major elements or major aspects which form a part of the research report. Thank you. ओए दोबारा बोल दो, रह गया, तुसी भी जल्दी जल्दी कर दे हो, वापस चलो, बोलो जी। हाँ मैंने ये तक करना ओके चलो आ जाओ, उन्होंने मैंने दिखाता हूँ मेरे दिमाग ते बंद कर, चलो आ जाओ, 2 मिनट हो लांगी करा। In addition to the various parameters for evaluating the major chapters and their elements, one can have a look at the total organization of the report, how the organization of report has been done by the researcher, whether it follows a pattern or whether the pattern is appropriate or not. Format, whether the formatting has been done as per the specification given by the university. The language is one which needs to be evaluated on the whole. So whether the person has used a language which was simple, comprehensible, and the language was grammatically correct and it conveyed the meaning of the researcher to the reader, and whether a coherence has been maintained in presenting the information in various chapters, and thus there was a facility in readability of the, and you can also evaluate the research report in terms of intellectual scholarship which has been exhibited by the researcher in writing a research report. And the next question is, who should evaluate the research report? The research report can be evaluated by the researcher himself. The researcher can prepare a checklist and can evaluate his own work against that checklist. The supervisors and the guides who are guiding the students for their master's work or the PhD work, they can evaluate a piece of research against the various parameters, or an external expert can also evaluate, as we have the practice that each thesis or dissertation is evaluated by an external expert or a group of external experts. So external experts who have the knowledge of the subject matter as well as the knowledge in the field of research can be involved in evaluating a piece of research. Funding agency can be another which can be involved in evaluating a piece of research because they need to take decision. They are pumping money into the research. So all these researcher, the guide, the expert and funding agency can evaluate a research report and can contribute to improving the quality of research and also suggesting for further research can take up further research or can design and implement training programs for enhancing the capabilities of researcher. Thank you.